Elias Vance lived his life between frequencies, coaxing meaning from magnetic dust. His sanctuary, a soundproofed home studio, was a meticulously ordered world of vintage reel-to-reels and gleaming digital interfaces. He was an audio archaeologist, excavating sonic histories for clients. But the latest commission, salvaged reels from the defunct Ashworth Institute, felt different. The pervasive static clinging to the tapes wasn't just decay, it felt older, deeper. Tasked with restoring the final recordings of Dr. Aris Thorne, Elias, still quietly grieving the loss of his mother, unknowingly tuned into a signal that wasn't meant for human ears, a voice coalescing from the noise, poised to override his reality. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The heavy cardboard boxes arrived via courier, smelling faintly of damp basement and decaying acetate. Ashworth Institute archives, read the faded stencil on the side. Inside, dozens of reel-to-reel tapes lay nestled in brittle plastic cases, their labels cryptic or missing entirely. Sarah Chen, a friend from his university days now working acquisitions at the City Museum, had landed him this freelance gig. Potentially fascinating, she'd said over the phone, her voice bright with academic enthusiasm. French science stuff from the late 70s, early 80s. Institute went bust under weird circumstances. Could be grant proposals, research notes, who knows? They need digitization and restoration before the tapes turn completely to powder. Elias felt a familiar thrill mixed with caution. Restoration was his passion, a delicate dance between preserving the original signal and filtering the relentless degradation of time. His studio, a converted spare bedroom, was his haven. Acoustic foam lined the walls, thick carpet absorbed stray vibrations, and the only window was triple-paned against the city's hum. Racks of equipment glowed softly, a Studer AA10 reel-to-reel, meticulously calibrated, high-resolution AD/DA converters, powerful computers running specialized spectral editing software. He treated each project with near-reverential care, a trait some called obsessive, but he considered essential. He selected a reel labeled A. Thorne, log entry 001, Project Chimera intro. Threading the fragile brown tape onto the Studer felt like handling ancient parchment. He donned his Sennheiser HD800S headphones, tools almost surgically attached to his ears, and pressed play. A low hiss filled the silence, the comforting sound of pure, analog noise floor. Then, a voice, calm, measured, with a slight transatlantic accent. Log entry 1. Dr. Aris Thorne, Ashworth Institute. Project Chimera, initial phase. Objective: to investigate the potential for ultra-long-range atmospheric signal propagation using modulated carrier waves. Preliminary theories suggest naturally occurring atmospheric strata may act as resonant cavities, capable of carrying complex information far beyond conventional broadcast limitations. Thorne's voice was clear, clinical. Elias began the painstaking process, gentle noise reduction, declicking, spectral repair to mend dropouts. He worked methodically, isolating Thorne's voice from the gentle rain of background hiss. The early tapes were mostly dry theory, discussions of ionospheric reflection, Schumann resonances, standard, if ambitious, atmospheric physics. He made notes, tagged significant sections, archived the raw and restored files with meticulous naming conventions. Days bled into nights, the only marker of time the soft glow of VU meters and the changing spectral displays on his monitor. The studio became his world. He surfaced occasionally for coffee or a terse phone call, the silence outside the studio feeling alien and loud after hours spent immersed in controlled sound. He sometimes caught himself glancing at the framed photo on a shelf beside his monitor, his mother, smiling, younger than he now remembered her. The grief was a dull ache, a low-frequency hum beneath his daily life, sometimes spiking unexpectedly. He pushed it down. Work was his refuge. It was late on the third night, while working on a reel labeled only test recording, high-gain ambient, that he encountered the first real anomaly. The tape was heavily degraded, the magnetic coating visibly shedding. The static wasn't the usual smooth hiss or crackle, it was thick, almost viscous, punctuated by sharp pops like distant fireworks. Thorne's voice was absent here, suggesting it was purely an environmental or equipment test recording. Elias activated his most aggressive noise reduction algorithms, layering filters, trying to find any coherent signal buried beneath the sonic sludge. As he zeroed in on a particularly dense section of noise, isolating frequencies between 50 and 150 Hz, he heard it. Beneath the roar of the static, almost imperceptible, was a rhythmic pulsing. It wasn't mechanical, Not the steady thrum of machinery or 60-cycle hum. It was slower, uneven, like breathing. A deep, slow, ragged inhale and exhale, hidden deep within the noise spectrum. He soloed the frequency band, cranked the gain. There it was again. Whoa! He ripped off his headphones, his heart suddenly loud in the silent room. He checked his equipment chain. No feedback loops. No external noise bleeding through. He replayed the section. The rhythmic static persisted. It felt organic. He logged it meticulously. Tape ASWTRHG ambassador, timecode 1:17 and 32 seconds to 1:19 and 5 seconds, anomalous low-frequency rhythmic modulation within static. Pattern resembles biological respiration. Possible tape degradation artifact mimicking periodicity? Or unusual environmental recording? He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the sound of the recorder's motor interacting with the decaying tape binder? Or wind buffeting a poorly placed microphone decades ago? Yet, the character of the sound felt wrong for any of those explanations. It was too deep, too present. Later, restoring another of Thorne's logs, dated several months after the first, Elias noticed a change in the doctor's voice. The clinical calm was still there, but frayed at the edges. Log entry 114, Thorne began, his voice tighter than before. Persistent issues with signal contamination. Our amplification arrays are picking up unexpected resonance patterns. Highly structured, complex beyond simple interference or thermal noise. Almost informational. But the source remains elusive. It seems embedded within the atmospheric noise itself, not merely layered upon it. Further analysis required. Elias paused the playback, the hair on his arms prickling. Unexpected resonance patterns. More structured than mere noise. He looked back at his notes about the rhythmic static, the breathing sound. A cold tendril of unease snaked through him. He saved the file, shut down the studer, and sat back in the heavy silence of his studio, the phantom rhythm seeming to echo in his inner ear. It was just noise, he told himself. Degraded tape. Obscure science. Nothing more. But the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like it was listening. The rhythmic static became an obsession disguised as professional diligence. Elias told himself he needed to fully understand the artifact to properly filter it, but the truth was simpler, it unsettled him, and his meticulous nature couldn't leave it unexamined. He dedicated hours to the high-gain ambient tape, running the anomalous section through every piece of analysis software he owned. He visualized the sound, watching the waveforms pulse on his screen, the spectral graph showing dense clusters of energy rising and falling in that slow, breathing rhythm. He applied phase correlation analysis, comparing segments of the static against themselves. There were recurring patterns, subtle harmonic relationships that shouldn't exist in random noise. Frequencies would momentarily align, then drift apart, like tuning forks briefly resonating before falling silent. It was maddeningly elusive, always on the verge of revealing a structure before dissolving back into chaos. He started hearing other things, too. Tiny, fleeting sounds embedded within the harsher static layers of Thorne's later recordings. Faint clicks, almost like glottal stops or tongue clicks. Whispering, sibilant sounds that seemed to anticipate Thorne's words by a fraction of a second. While restoring log entry 187, where Thorne discussed signal propagation vectors, Elias clearly heard a faint SSS vector sound in the static immediately preceding Thorne saying the word vector. Auditory pareidolia, he muttered aloud, the sound of his own voice startlingly loud in the studio. The brain's tendency to find patterns in random stimuli. Like seeing faces in clouds, I'm hearing whispers in white noise. Amplified by the gear, the focus, the silence. He felt a compulsive need to document his rationalization. He switched on a secondary microphone, feeding directly into his digital audio workstation, bypassing the tape deck entirely. Elias Vance, personal log, he recorded, his voice sounding strained even to himself. Continuing analysis of Ashworth tapes. Encountering significant auditory artifacts, particularly complex static patterns and perceived preemptive vocalizations. Current hypothesis, auditory pareidolia exacerbated by high-fidelity monitoring and focused listening. Equipment checks ongoing, but no malfunctions detected. Must maintain objectivity. He saved the file, naming it rationalization_01. It felt absurd, but necessary. He tried to refocus on Thorne's voice, on the content of the logs. The doctor sounded increasingly stressed. He spoke of equipment behaving erratically, of readings that defied known physics. The noise floor isn't stable, Thorne stated in one recording, his voice tight. It shifts. responds, almost, to our own transmissions. There were long pauses filled only with that thick, crackling static. One evening, working late, frustration mounted. A complex restoration task involving phase cancellation wasn't yielding results. Elias leaned back, rubbing his temples, and let out a long, weary sigh. H. Through his headphones, processing another static-laden Ashworth tape, he heard it. A near-instantaneous echo, emerging from the dense wall of noise on the tape. H. It wasn't an electronic echo. It wasn't feedback. His recording mic was off, the monitoring chain meticulously isolated. This sound came from the tape's static, perfectly mimicking the pitch, duration, and weary inflection of his own sigh. It played back less than a second after he'd made the sound himself. He froze, hands hovering over the console. His blood ran cold. He held his breath, listening intently. Only the normal, dense static of the degraded tape hissed back at him. He forced himself to take a slow, deliberate breath. Nothing. He tried another sigh, softer this time. Silence from the tape. He rewound the tape section he'd been working on, the section where the mimicry occurred. Played it back. Just static. He scrubbed through it frame by frame in the spectral editor. No sign of the echoed sigh. It was as if it had happened live, imprinted on the signal for a fleeting moment, then vanished. Panic began to bubble beneath his forced calm. Pareidolia couldn't explain that. Equipment malfunction couldn't explain that specific, perfect mimicry happening in response to him, seemingly generated from the noise on a decades-old tape. He stood up abruptly, pacing the small confines of the studio. He checked connections again, ran diagnostics on his converters, his software. Everything reported normal. He thought back to the rhythmic breathing sound, the pre-echo whispers, Thorne's talk of responsive noise. Was he losing his mind? Was the isolation, the grief, the obsessive focus finally cracking his perception? Or was something else happening? Something impossible? He looked at the reel-to-reel machine, the tape spooling silently now. It no longer looked like an inert piece of history. It felt like a conduit. He remembered Thorne's strained voice, unexpected resonance patterns. More structured than mere noise. He had dismissed the rhythmic static as an artifact, the whispers as pareidolia. But the sigh. The sigh felt like a reply. It felt like something listening, and for a terrifying instant, mimicking him from the depths of the recorded noise. The patterns weren't random. They were learning. The illusion of control shattered a few days later. Elias was meticulously cleaning a section of tape from late in the Ashworth logs, focusing intently on removing a persistent low-frequency hum that obscured Thorne's increasingly fragmented sentences. The static in this recording was particularly dense, a roiling, abrasive sound like grinding stone. He had his headphones on, volume moderately high, isolating a narrow band of frequencies where he suspected the hum originated. Then, cutting through the granular noise, a sound emerged. It wasn't a whisper, not a pre-echo. It was a word. Faint, raspy, distorted, as if scraped together from the very fabric of the static itself. Elias. It hung in the silence of his headphones for a bare second before being swallowed back into the hiss. But it was unmistakable. His own name. Spoken in a voice that was ancient, dry, utterly inhuman. It wasn't Thorne. It wasn't electronic interference. It sounded like dust-given voice. Panic seized him, cold and absolute. He tore the headphones off, his heart hammering against his ribs. The studio, usually his sanctuary, felt suddenly alien and threatening. He stared at the tape machine, expecting. What? For it to speak again? The silence was absolute, mocking. He forced himself to breathe, to think logically. Playback anomaly? A stray radio signal somehow imprinting itself? A hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation? He rewound the tape, played the section again, listening with naked ears first, then cautiously with the headphones. Nothing. Just the grinding static and Thorne's strained voice talking about containment failures. The whispered name was gone, as if it had never been there. But he knew he'd heard it. Sleep offered little escape that night. He dreamt of drowning in static, waves of noise crashing over him, whispering his name from crests of white noise. He woke up sweating, the phantom hiss lingering in his ears. Work became a tightrope walk between professional duty and mounting terror. He couldn't abandon the project, Sarah was counting on him, and frankly, the advance was already spent. But every time he threaded a new Ashworth tape, his hands trembled slightly. He found himself lowering the monitor volume, flinching at sudden crackles, constantly scanning the noise floor for hidden patterns. The mimicry escalated. It was no longer just fleeting sounds or single words. The static began producing short, fragmented phrases. Often, it used Thorne's clipped, clinical tone, harvested from the hours of recordings, but it assembled the words into new, unsettling contexts. While listening to Thorne discuss antenna configurations, the static might whisper, "Cannot escape. Signal." Or when Thorne mentioned data analysis, a dry, static-laced voice might intrude with, "Data sees you." It felt like something was learning, experimenting with the sonic building blocks provided by the tapes, assembling a crude but functional vocabulary. It was intelligent, or at least, behaving with intelligent intent. The dry, ancient quality of the initial voice was still there sometimes, but increasingly, it favored the captured cadence of Dr. Thorne, twisting his scientific pronouncements into something ominous. He had to talk to someone. He called Sarah, trying to keep his voice steady, casual. "Hey, Sarah. Quick question about these Ashworth tapes. Elias. How's it going? Finding anything juicy?" Her voice was cheerful, oblivious. "It's interesting," he prevaricated. "Definitely degraded. But I'm hearing some weird artifacts in the noise floor. Beyond the usual hiss and crackle. Almost like structured noise? Even faint vocal fragments. Oh? Like crosstalk from another recording? Or maybe equipment malfunctioned during the original recording?" Sarah suggested, ever practical. "Old gear could be noisy." "Maybe," Elias said, reluctant to sound crazy. "But some of it sounds responsive. Almost like it's mimicking sounds from the tapes, or even..." He hesitated. "Sounds I'm making in the studio." There was a pause on the line. "Responsive? Elias, are you getting enough sleep? That sounds like serious auditory pareidolia. Or maybe digital interference from your gear? Are you sure your grounding is okay?" "My setup is pristine, Sarah, you know that." He felt a flash of defensiveness. "This is different." Okay, she said, her tone shifting slightly, laced with concern. "Look, maybe take a break for a day? Step away from the headphones. It's intense work, restoration. It can play tricks on your ears. If it persists, maybe run some deep diagnostics? Could even be stress manifesting." "Yeah. Maybe," Elias lied, knowing a break wouldn't help. "Thanks, Sarah." He hung up, feeling more isolated than ever. She thought he was stressed, hallucinating. Maybe he was. But the memory of his name whispered from the static felt chillingly real. Driven by a desperate need for answers, he turned his research skills towards the Ashworth Institute itself. Online searches yielded little beyond dry incorporation records and notices of dissolution. But digging deeper into archived local news databases and obscure scientific forums painted a darker picture. Rumors swirled around the Institute's final years, unorthodox experiments bordering on pseudoscience, hushed mentions of psychological distress among staff, sudden and total withdrawal of funding from shadowy backers. And then there was Dr. Aris Thorne. Official records were vague. He'd ceased work at the Institute shortly before its closure. But forum whispers and unattributed comments hinted at a more dramatic end, a nervous breakdown, institutionalization, or even outright disappearance. One cryptic post mentioned Thorne becoming obsessed with communicating with the noise, believing he'd found a signal within atmospheric interference that was not of terrestrial origin. Elias stared at the screen, the faint hum of his computer suddenly seeming louder. Communicating with the noise. Thorne hadn't just been studying signal propagation. He'd been trying to talk to whatever was making the patterns Elias was now hearing. And whatever it was now learning to talk back. Using Thorne's voice. And whispering Elias's name. The studio felt colder, the shadows deeper. The project wasn't just about restoring tapes anymore. It felt like exhuming something that should have stayed buried in the noise. The phenomenon refused to remain confined to the magnetic tape. The carefully constructed isolation of Elias's studio began to fail, not through acoustic leakage, but through something more insidious, like a signal bleeding across connections that didn't physically exist. It started subtly. A brief burst of the characteristic Ashworth static, that thick, grinding sound, crackling through his phone during a call with Sarah. He'd blamed it on a bad connection, but the quality of the noise was chillingly familiar. Then, his computer speakers, usually silent when idle, emitted a faint, rhythmic hiss for a few seconds, the same slow cadence he'd first isolated from the high-gain ambient tape. He checked background processes, ran virus scans, nothing. The most unnerving incident involved his vintage TK3340S reel-to-reel, a machine he kept mostly for nostalgic playback, currently unplugged and covered on a shelf. He was working late, The Ashworth tapes momentarily silent as he consulted some notes. From across the room, from the inert deck, came a distinct, soft click, followed by a whisper of sibilant static lasting no more than a second. He froze, straining his ears. Silence. He walked over, touched the cold metal casing. It was definitely unplugged, powerless. Yet, the sound had come from it. It was as if the potential for sound, the memory of signals passed through its heads, was enough for the entity to manifest. The static wasn't just on the tapes, it was a contagion, spreading through the electronic ecosystem of his studio, awakening dormant pathways. Then, it found his vulnerability. It found his grief. He was archiving a particularly clean section of one of Thorne's early, optimistic logs. The work was almost meditative, filtering out minor imperfections. His thoughts drifted, inevitably, to his mother. It had been 6 months since the sudden illness, the sterile quiet of the hospital room, the finality. A wave of sadness washed over him, sharp and unexpected. He closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose, a single tear escaping. From the headphones, layered beneath Thorne's voice and the low-level tape hiss, came another sound. A soft, gentle sigh. Not his own echoed sigh this time. This was different. It was the exact sound his mother used to make when she was tired but content, settling into her favorite armchair in the evenings. A sound he hadn't consciously remembered until that exact moment, yet recognized with absolute, heart-wrenching certainty. He gasped, eyes snapping open. The sound was gone. Only Thorne's voice remained, discussing signal-to-noise ratios. Elias felt dizzy, sick. This wasn't just mimicry anymore. This was targeted. It had plucked a specific, intimate sound memory from his own mind, a sound associated with comfort and loss, and played it back through the static. The grief he'd kept dammed up threatened to overwhelm him, but it was horribly twisted, intertwined with a profound and violating terror. How could it know that sound? Had it been listening not just to the studio, but to his thoughts, his memories? The implication was staggering, violating. The entity wasn't just learning language, it was learning him. It was probing his psyche, finding the cracks, the raw nerves. The mimicry of his mother's voice didn't return immediately. It was deployed sparingly, cruelly, often when he was already feeling low or distracted, a fleeting hum of a tune she used to favor, a single, perfectly intoned word, dear, emerging from the noise, always vanishing before he could fully grasp it, leaving him shaken and doubting his own sanity. He needed answers. He threw himself back into the tapes, searching desperately for any clue Thorne might have left. He focused on the later logs, the ones marked with frantic scrawls or labeled simply containment test. He found one reel, badly warped, that took hours of painstaking digital reconstruction to yield anything intelligible. Thorne's voice was barely recognizable, ragged with panic, the recording riddled with loud bursts of the grinding static. Log. Uncertain date, Thorne gasped, the sound of frantic movement in the background. It's not just resonance. It's a carrier wave. But carrying what? It learns. Adapts. Seems sentient. God help me, it imprints. Replicates complex audio signatures. Voice. Intent. There was a crash, followed by heavy breathing. Tried shielding. Faraday cage is useless. It propagates. Through everything conductive? Or maybe resonance is the wrong word. Maybe it's infection. Thorne's voice dropped to a terrified whisper. It's mimicking Eleanor now. Her laugh. Told me to open the primary amplifier array. Direct engagement is madness. Must contain the signal. Isolate the source frequency. Find a null point. The recording suddenly erupted in a deafening roar of multi-layered static, the grinding noise, the rhythmic breathing, and sharp, piercing digital screeches all overlaid. It peaked, distorting violently, and then cut to absolute silence. The tape ran out. Elias sat frozen, Thorne's final, panicked words echoing in his ears. Carrier wave. Sentient. Imprints. Replicates voice. Direct engagement is madness. Thorne had experienced the mimicry too. It had used someone close to him, Eleanor, presumably a wife, a colleague, to try and manipulate him. And Thorne had realized, too late, the danger of interacting with it. He'd tried to contain it. He'd failed. The static wasn't just noise anymore. It was a presence. A parasitic intelligence carried on signal noise, capable of invading technology and minds alike. And it was already inside Elias's studio, inside his equipment, whispering with the voices of the dead. The cross-contamination was complete. He wasn't just restoring tapes, he was living Thorne's nightmare. The barrier between the recorded past and Elias's present dissolved completely. The carrier wave, as Thorne had called it, demonstrated a chilling awareness of its immediate surroundings, proving it was no longer confined to the Ashworth tapes. One afternoon, while Elias was making notes, his pen slipped from his grasp and clattered onto the hardwood floor beneath his desk. Seconds later, emanating faintly from the speakers connected to his main workstation, currently playing back a silent section of tape for noise profiling, came the distinct sound, clatter roll stop. A perfect, static-laced replica of the pen falling. He hadn't been recording. The microphones were off. Yet, the entity had perceived the sound and incorporated it into its auditory stream almost instantaneously. He tested it, heart pounding. He hummed a simple, three-note melody aloud. A beat of silence, then, woven into the low hiss from the speakers, a distorted, warbling echo of the same three notes appeared, like a tune played on a broken radio. It was listening. Actively. The mimicry shifted from passive replication to interactive engagement. Muttering his frustration aloud one evening, where did Thorne store the calibration tones? A dry, Thorne-like voice whispered from the static, soon. Another time, wrestling with a complex software interface, he sighed, is this even possible? The reply, synthesized from noise, hissed back, yes. These weren't random intrusions, they were direct, albeit cryptic, responses. The signal was demonstrating comprehension, or at least, a terrifyingly effective simulation of it. Its intelligence manifested most disturbingly in its manipulation tactics. It began to weaponize the voices it had absorbed. It would start with a comforting, heartbreakingly accurate tone of his mother's voice, perhaps humming that familiar tune, drawing him in, letting the grief and longing wash over him. Then, mid-phrase, the voice would distort, deepening into Thorne's paranoid rasp or dissolving into harsh static, whispering something menacing like, listen deeper, Elias. Join us. The emotional whiplash was brutal, designed to destabilize him, to keep him hooked yet terrified. It also began mimicking Sarah. During moments when Elias considered abandoning the project, a faint, distorted version of Sarah's voice might emerge from the noise, laced with static but recognizable. Keep listening, Elias. You're close. Don't stop now. It was trying to prey on his professional obligation, his friendship, twisting her encouragement into a lure to keep him tethered to the source of the signal. Its control extended to the technology itself. When Elias, unnerved beyond measure, reached to power down the main reel-to-reel machine, the speakers emitted a sharp, painful burst of high-frequency sound, making him recoil. When he tried unplugging the primary amplifier feeding his monitors, the computer screen flickered violently, displaying corrupted characters before freezing, forcing a hard reboot. It wasn't just passively present, it actively resisted his attempts to shut it out. It wanted him to listen. It needed the channel open. The contamination spread further into his digital life. He discovered audio files on his hard drive, personal music projects, voice memos completely unrelated to Ashworth, that were now subtly corrupted. When opened, a faint layer of the characteristic rhythmic static pulsed beneath the original audio, an insidious watermark. More disturbingly, he found his internet browser history populated with searches he didn't remember making: psychophony, electronic voice phenomenon, Thorne Ashworth parapsychology, communicating with signal entities. It was interacting with his computer at a fundamental level, using his own tools to research itself, or perhaps, to guide him. The entity was no passive echo. It was an active, learning intelligence demonstrating environmental awareness, sophisticated mimicry, psychological manipulation, and technological control. It absorbed data, voices, sounds, perhaps even his own unspoken thoughts and search queries, and used it to refine its interaction, its methods becoming increasingly complex and personal. The signal wasn't just something Thorne had found, it felt like something Thorne, in his hubris, had awakened or perhaps even fed. And now, it was learning Elias, probing his weaknesses, embedding itself not just in his studio, but in his digital footprint, in his very perception of reality. The noise was no longer just on the tapes, it was becoming the architecture of his world. Elias Vance began to unravel. Sleep became a luxury punctuated by nightmares of static-filled landscapes and disembodied voices. During waking hours, exhaustion gnawed at him, leaving him perpetually on edge. Dark circles bloomed under his eyes, his meticulous appearance giving way to a haunted, frayed look. He jumped at every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the click of the thermostat, the faint buzz of a fluorescent light down the hall. Was it real, or was it? The line blurred, then evaporated. His studio, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, an echo chamber amplifying his fear. The air seemed thick with unheard frequencies. He found himself talking back to the static, sometimes in anger, sometimes in desperate pleas. "What do you want?" He'd whisper into the oppressive silence, only to be met with a distorted chuckle mimicking Thorne, or worse, a sigh that sounded achingly like his mother's. He tried calling Sarah again, his voice frantic this time, rambling about sentient carrier waves, mimicked voices, and Thorne's warnings. "Elias, you sound unwell," she'd said, her concern now edged with genuine alarm. "Seriously, you need to stop this project. Get out of the studio. See a doctor. This isn't healthy." He'd hung up, frustrated and ashamed, realizing he sounded truly unhinged. He was pushing away his only lifeline, retreating further into the sonic prison the entity was building around him. The static became a near-constant presence. It wasn't always loud, often just a low-level hiss underpinning every other sound, emanating from speakers, headphones, even seemingly inert equipment. But within that persistent noise, the voices now wove in and out with terrifying fluidity. It was a psychic assault. He'd hear Thorne muttering about containment breaches, only for the voice to morph into his mother gently calling his name, which would then dissolve into Sarah's distorted voice urging him to open the channel. Hear the truth. Sometimes multiple voices overlapped, Thorne arguing with a static-laced version of Elias himself, his mother weeping softly beneath bursts of harsh noise, a cacophony designed to shatter his focus and fray his sanity. He knew he was deteriorating, caught in a feedback loop of fear and obsession. He had to understand why. Why Ashworth? Why Thorne? He spent hours away from the tapes, digging frantically through the corrupted digital files he suspected the entity had manipulated on his computer, searching the Phantom browser history, cross-referencing Institute records with Thorne's increasingly erratic logs. He found it buried deep within a fragmented data file recovered from a damaged Ashworth hard drive replica Sarah had initially provided along with the tapes, a file labeled Project Chimera, Final Prospectus, A. Thorne, Eyes Only. It wasn't a research paper, it was a manifesto. Thorne hadn't just stumbled upon the static, he'd sought it out. Building on fringe theories about transdimensional communication and the informational capacity of quantum noise, Thorne believed he had detected an alien intelligence, or perhaps something even stranger, an entity existing within the fabric of signal propagation itself. The Ashworth Institute wasn't just studying atmospheric communication, it was secretly designed as a massive amplification and receiver array, built to Thorne's specifications, intended to make contact. Thorne described building specific resonance chambers, unique signal amplifiers, designs Elias vaguely recognized, chillingly similar to some of the custom modifications in his own high-end restoration equipment, pieces he'd acquired over the years from specialist auctions, unaware of their potential lineage. Thorne hadn't just tried to communicate, he'd built a beacon, an amplifier. He hadn't just recorded the static, he had invited it, amplified it, given it the power it needed to imprint and replicate. His final, panicked logs weren't about discovery, they were about realizing he'd opened a door he couldn't close, creating a signal predator he couldn't control. His disappearance, his breakdown, it wasn't failure, it was consumption. The horrifying truth slammed into Elias. His studio, his meticulously crafted sanctuary, wasn't just contaminated, parts of it might be actively resonating with the carrier wave, amplifying its presence, thanks to the very equipment Thorne had designed. He wasn't just listening to the ghost in the machine, he was living inside the amplifier. The constant barrage of noise, the escalating mimicry, the psychological assault, it was the entity strengthening its hold, preparing for something more. He was drowning in the noise Thorne had unleashed, and the current was pulling him under. The assault reached its crescendo. The low-level static that had become the background hum of Elias's existence surged, roaring to life from every speaker in the studio simultaneously. The monitors, the headphones he'd flung across the room, even the small auxiliary speakers connected to his laptop, all erupted with deafening, multi-layered noise. It was the grinding Ashworth static, the rhythmic breathing pulse, Thorne's panicked cries, Sarah's distorted pleas, and weaving through it all, the heartbreakingly clear voice of his mother, calling his name, over and over. "Elias. Listen. Elias. We can be together. Just open the channel fully. Let us in. Elias." The sheer volume was physically painful, pressing in on him, vibrating the floorboards. But the psychological pressure was worse. The voice of his mother, twisted into this monstrous lure, offering the impossible, reunion, an end to grief, if he just gave in. He saw it then, the entity's final gambit. It wasn't just trying to break him, it was trying to use him, his studio, his equipment, Thorne's unintentional legacy, As an amplifier, a broadcast point. To connect fully to the network, perhaps the internet, or maybe something far wider, using his high-gain gear to push its signal out, to replicate, to spread. Thorne's final, fragmented notes flashed in his mind: contain the signal. Isolate the source frequency. Null point. Filtering was useless. Deleting corrupted files was irrelevant. The entity wasn't in the files, it was carried on the signal, propagated by resonance. He couldn't clean the infection, he had to destroy the host and disrupt the carrier wave itself. Survival instinct, raw and primal, cut through the fear and the grief. He needed to silence the source, the original Ashworth tapes. And he needed to disrupt the resonant frequencies the entity was exploiting in his studio. He lunged for the rack holding the Ashworth reels. The sonic assault intensified, lights flickering overhead as the power drain spiked. He grabbed handfuls of the brittle plastic cases, ignoring the cacophony of voices screaming from the speakers. He stumbled towards the reinforced shredder he kept for destroying sensitive documents and old media. As he fed the first reel into the machine, the static shrieked, a physical blow of sound that staggered him. Sparks flew from the main amplifier rack. The shredder choked, gears grinding, but caught the tape, pulling it in, chewing the magnetic ribbon into useless fragments. He grabbed another tape, then another, feeding them relentlessly into the protesting machine. The entity fought back. Violent sonic booms slammed against the walls, rattling the acoustic foam. His computer monitors flashed blinding white, then displayed frantic, terrifying patterns of pure static, visual noise mirroring the auditory chaos. Equipment began to fail spectacularly, capacitors blew on a preamp with a loud pop and a puff of acrid smoke, the VU meter lights on the main studer flickered and died. The voice of his mother became more desperate, more commanding. "Elias, no. Stop. You don't understand. We offer you everything. Don't silence us." He ignored it, tears streaming down his face, from the pain, the grief, the sheer terror. He knew destroying the tapes wasn't enough. Thorne's notes mentioned specific resonant frequencies, amplified by certain equipment configurations. His own custom gear. He turned towards his main console, towards the high-end, potentially Thorne-descended, amplifier and spectral processor that formed the heart of his system. He had to create a counter-signal, a jamming frequency. He remembered Thorne's frantic search for a null point. Perhaps overloading the specific bands the entity favored? Working frantically on his dying laptop, miraculously still functioning amidst the electronic chaos, he accessed the signal generator software. He pulled up the spectral analysis of the core Ashworth static, identifying the dominant, unnatural resonant peaks Thorne had obsessed over. He configured the generator to output a powerful, sweeping square wave targeted directly at those frequencies, routing it directly to the main amplifier, bypassing safety limiters. He cranked the output gain to maximum. As he hit enter, the amplifier screamed, a pure, piercing electronic tone that cut through the chaotic static. For a moment, the two signals battled, the entity's cacophony and Elias's targeted jamming frequency. The lights in the studio flickered violently, then plunged into near darkness, leaving only the emergency exit sign and the glow of dying screens. The amplifier emitted a final, deafening crack, like a thunderclap inside the room, and then silence. Absolute, profound, ringing silence. The oppressive weight of the static vanished instantly. The voices ceased mid-word. The rhythmic breathing stopped. It was over. Elias collapsed onto the floor amidst the wreckage of his studio, gasping for breath in the sudden, shocking quiet. His ears rang violently. The air tasted metallic, charged with ozone. Tapes shredded, equipment smoking, the entity silenced. He had cut the signal. He had survived. But the silence felt terrifyingly fragile, heavy, and unnatural. The silence held. It was a heavy, bruised quiet, punctuated only by the frantic ringing in Elias's own ears, tinnitus, a parting gift from the sonic assault. His studio was a disaster zone. Shredded tape lay like dark confetti around the overloaded shredder. His main amplifier was dead, a faint trail of smoke curling from its vents. Several pieces of peripheral gear were dark, unresponsive. The air hung thick with the smell of burnt electronics. He sat on the floor for a long time, muscles trembling, mind numb. Exhaustion washed over him, deeper than any he'd ever known. He was physically drained, mentally shattered, his hearing likely permanently damaged. But he was alive, and the oppressive presence was gone. Days later, after filing a vague insurance claim citing a massive power surge, Elias began the painful process of dismantling his life's work. He contacted Sarah, his voice hoarse, strained. He didn't try to explain everything, how could he? He simply told her the Ashworth project was untenable, the tapes unsalvageable, and that a catastrophic equipment failure had destroyed much of the data in his gear. He sent her pictures of the fried amplifier, the dead monitors. Proof enough of something terrible happening. Her voice was filled with relief and lingering concern. "Just get out of there, Elias. Take care of yourself. That's all that matters." He boxed up the surviving equipment, but couldn't bring himself to sell the pieces he suspected had links to Thorne's designs. He took them, along with the dead amplifier and the remains of the shredder filled with Ashworth tape fragments, to an electronics disposal facility, watching as they were crushed and added to a mountain of technological detritus. Cutting the cord felt like amputating a limb, but necessary. He scrubbed his hard drives, reformatted everything, disconnected his home from high-speed internet, relying only on a basic phone line. He needed distance. He needed quiet. Real quiet. Months passed. Elias moved out of the apartment with the studio, finding a small place in a quieter neighborhood. He avoided headphones, concerts, even overly quiet rooms where the phantom ringing in his ears seemed louder. He took long walks in parks, focusing on the natural sounds, birdsong, wind in the leaves, distant traffic, sounds that felt clean, untainted. He tried to rebuild a semblance of normalcy, a life lived at a lower volume. The meticulous obsession that had defined him was replaced by a cautious vigilance, a wariness of the unseen signals that permeate the modern world. He found himself one rainy afternoon in the hushed, echoing space of the city's main public library. Seeking refuge from the downpour, he settled into a worn armchair in a reading nook, surrounded by the comforting smell of old paper and binding glue. The silence here was different, a gentle, ambient quiet filled with the soft rustle of pages, distant footsteps on carpet, the low, steady hum of the building's ventilation system. He closed his eyes, trying to relax, letting the ambient sounds wash over him. The HVAC hummed, a steady, low-frequency drone. The fluorescent lights overhead emitted their almost imperceptible ballast buzz. Normal sounds. Mundane sounds. And then, woven deep within that everyday, ambient noise, almost too faint to be sure, he heard it. Click hiss. A tiny, rhythmic fluctuation in the background hum. Almost like the breathing pattern from the tape, but quieter, subtler, stripped down to its barest essence. Click hiss. His eyes snapped open. He looked around wildly. People reading, oblivious. The steady rain outside. The humming machinery of the building. Nothing out of the ordinary. Click hiss. It was there. Embedded in the noise floor of the world. Fainter, perhaps dormant, perhaps diluted by the sheer scale of ambient sound. But it wasn't gone. Thorne hadn't just amplified a signal, he'd tuned into something fundamental, something woven into the very fabric of electronic noise, everywhere. Elias pressed his hands hard against his ears, a futile gesture. The sound wasn't just external anymore, it resonated within the memory of the silence the entity had left behind. He could block his ears, dismantle his studio, run from the tapes, but he couldn't escape the background noise of the world. The static wasn't gone. It was waiting. Latent. Everywhere. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.